I'm Carole Taylor. On this edition of Journal, we examine economic reconciliation in action, not just in theory. Chief Epp is chief of the Chee-act-in First Nations. It's one of 9 First Nations in the Chilliwack area. What they have managed to achieve is remarkable. The Conference Board of Canada has done reports identifying the factors that lead to successful economic development for First Nations communities. In brief, they are strong leadership and vision, an economic development plan, access to capital, good governance and management, accountability, and strong relationships and partnerships. The Chee-act-in have ticked all these boxes under Chief Epp's leadership. Derek adds one more essential value: ownership. He is an active investor, developer, partner. And as he says, they've flipped the script and gone from being 90% government-supported to 90% own source funding. As well, as a result of their emphasis on healthcare and mental health support, they now have no children in the ministry's care. Chief Epp is a visionary as he tries novel solutions to the issues a small urban reserve faces. While his first degree was in social work with a specialization in First Nations studies, he's gone on to study Aboriginal management at UBC. He is comfortable talking zoning, infrastructure, financial partnerships, taxes, and deal-making, all part of the Chee-act-in success story. Chief Chief Epp joins us to discuss why his model works and what others can learn from their experience. Back in a moment. Chief Chief Epp joins us now to talk about economic reconciliation, but really it's integration, where you have an economic story to tell. And I was so amazed the first time I heard some of the details. Tell me, what are the biggest challenges for you? Called yourself a small urban reserve. So what's the biggest challenge?
Yeah, good morning. I think that's a really good question. It's one of our biggest challenges is growth. We're likely going to hit an economic ceiling with our current land base. So when we, are really through the process of doing our land use planning or land development, whether it be leasing out land or joint venturing with developers to do different styles of economic development, we don't have the luxury of being able to tap into our traditional territory or have municipal-like boundaries that are a little bit more vast. So most First Nations communities have quite small reserve boundaries, and so really we have to be very creative, but also very logical and very sure that the developments that we are doing or the economic development approaches we are doing are going to stand the test of time and going to bring in that tax base or that economic base that is going to ensure that we can actually provide for the next 7 generations. And really part of it then is expanding that land base. That's a big push across the country right now with urban reserves or the additions to reserve process to ensure that we can expand our land base.
So let's talk about this additions to reserve, because I honestly didn't know that was possible.
Yes.
So it doesn't have to be a contiguous piece of property?
Right now, it still is one of the more, I guess, controversial parts of the policy. It still is. So the land that Chee-act-in or Chee-act-il just recently acquired is continuous or adjacent to our reserve boundaries, and that's where the easier processes are with the addition to reserve. And going back to your first comment, it really wasn't that possible, with the current addition to reserve policy. So what we did was a pilot project to show what can happen when you actually move at the speed of business and able to add land to reserve in a timely manner.
So how do you do that? You just say, okay, there's a nice piece of property. To whom do you appeal? You have to buy the property.
Yeah, there's got to be a willing seller and willing buyer, just like any real estate transaction. We're a willing buyer. We had a willing seller that worked with for a number of years, negotiated a purchase price, put together the purchase and sale agreement, and then I went to the federal government in partnership with the Lands Advisory Board, one of our main First Nations national institutions that helps divulge some of these jurisdictions from the federal government to First Nations. And really that's the crux of it, is First Nations have to have that underlying jurisdiction of all of our economic powers. And that helps speed up some of these processes. So we did a pilot project with the federal government to show that like the average time for an addition to reserve was anywhere from 3 to 30 years. In 3 years, yeah, I laughed too, right? 3 years was exceptionally fast. So the fact that we did all the legal stuff in 6 months and the bureaucratic steps in 3 months was really unheard of. Doing that in 9 months, that was a relationship with our local municipality, relationship with the provincial government, and relationship with the various ministries in the federal government that had to put their pens and work into this project.
So relationships are really important.
Yeah, but and also, setting a bit of a precedent and a bit of a tone as to, we feel, and I feel, my nation has the capacity. We essentially had to do the work for the federal government and complete the addition to reserve process for them to make sure that we could actually do it in a timely manner and work with the Department of Justice to get all the legal aspects done. A lot of it was really asserting our jurisdictions and liabilities over the process.
And so that means not only do you need to come up with capital, but you have to have the human capital that has all these skill sets if you had to do the work, like lawyers and...
100%. Yeah, it takes, you're right. It doesn't just take the economic capital, but, and that's where, where I play politics is in these First Nations institutions that are all governed by the First Nations Financial Management Act or Fiscal Management Act, the First Nations Lands Management Act. There's these now 5 institutions that really are solely tasked with supporting First Nations to assert their land and economic jurisdictions. And that's where a lot of the capacity is being built now, is through these processes, through law development, human capacity development, financial capacity development. So, and that's where you're seeing a lot of the communities across Canada beginning to thrive. Yeah.
And so where did you get capital? Did financial institutions just roll over and say, here's some money?
No, so what we knew through some of our progressive economic development ventures, we put money away for a land back strategy to go and try to buy this land back. And that took a number of years of asserting taxation jurisdiction, but through the First Nations Tax Commission. But I always say we are still playing with a very limited economic toolbox. So really trying to open up that toolbox is critical. But we did, how we got that was from leveraging our strategic advantage for our location, which is, residential, commercial, light industrial, collecting a tax base off of that and making sure that we are planning for our future generations by using that capital appropriately. But we've also been able to access capital at a competitive rate. I'm the chair of the First Nations Finance Authority. We have a little over, I think, $3.5 billion in loans out to First Nations right now. And we're just scaling. In January, we did a $650 million debenture or a bond to raise capital to support First Nations ventures. And many communities will need to access capital to go through this process. And now we can actually finally access capital at a competitive rate through the Finance Authority. Because prior to that, we were basically deemed a very risky borrower by banks or any financial institution, which came with it very high interest rates, which is not competitive when you're trying to play in real estate or trying to dabble in economic prosperity.
So have banks come around now?
They're starting to. They're starting to change their policies, their processes. There's still challenges. The Indian Act is definitely a challenge because you can't really use your land as an asset under the Indian Act, or it's tougher to. Through land code, we have such things called an A-to-A lease that we can actually leverage our land as an asset to actually go borrow against that. But, still the most competitive interest rates are still through the First Nations Finance Authority. Banks are getting better, but there's still lots of work to do.
And so when you do it through the Aboriginal Financing Authority, do you have ownership at the end of the day?
Oh yeah, of course, yeah.
How do you write the contracts?
So it's a pooled borrowing program. So we have, I think, somewhere around 150 borrowing members at the First Nations Finance Authority, and we have actually 375 communities who are scheduled to become borrowing members. So that's well over half of the First Nations communities across Canada. So we use the borrowing, really strength of those 150 plus communities revenue streams. And the First Nations Finance Authority actually has a mechanism where to protect the investors, we intercept the revenue streams from the community and to make sure that those revenue streams are going against the capital that's being borrowed. So it protects the investor, it protects the nation, and really we've never had any First Nations community in over a decade default on any mortgage payments or borrowing payments. So it really speaks to the strength and the capacity of the First Nations Finance Authority, but also the communities who are borrowing members of our organization.
And so you mentioned taxation, and I think it would surprise people to think that you are able, that's a big source of revenue for you. You tax people.
Yeah, it's probably one of the, I'm one of the chiefs that are willing to say it, that I love taxes to a certain extent. I think, society in general, we pay too high of taxes, but, for the property taxation, the property tax regime, that's something that any local or provincial government really depends on, and we're no different. We need those economic tools at any level of government really enables their progression and capacity building and their ability to invest in infrastructure, in housing for their members, or really participate and grow the economic portfolio of that nation. You need taxation to do that.
And do you tax your own people?
Yeah, so we have a First Nation sales tax, or almost like a goods and services tax in all of our commercial shopping centers, and all of our members pay that as well.
We're going to take a short break, and when we come back, I'm going to ask Derek if he will walk me through one of his big projects. It's a very successful shopping mall, for instance, and we'll learn some of the things that worked and maybe some of the things that didn't, and useful information for other groups as well. We'll be back in a moment. Derek, I'd like to ask you to take apart the shopping mall deal and explain how that came together and what the bumps were along the way and why it's so important.
Yeah, I think it's important to acknowledge some of the past leaders who took that on. Grand Chief Joe Hall, at the time was Chief Ken Malloway, and then Chief Glenda Campbell picked it up as well. And we had some very creative partners along the way. One including was the Gulf Pacific Group, a property management company. And in those days, it was through the Indian Act, there was actually policies in place that didn't enable First Nations to actually leverage community-owned land for economic development opportunities. So we actually had to get in a very unique and creative legal measure to actually lease that land for $1 to the Gulf Pacific Group to go and develop. We paid for all the bricks and mortar and all the development of it. And then at the end of the project, they leased it back to us for $1. So we had to work around the Indian Act in the 90s to actually go in and try to conduct some kind of economic development. We had a lot of pushback from the past mayor and council in the city of Chilliwack. They basically laughed at us, saying First Nations are never going to be able to have this kind of success. Good luck. Nobody's going to shop at the shopping center. When you fast forward nearly 30 years, 25 plus years, even through COVID, we had zero vacancy rates. We had, that's one of the most successful shopping centers in that southern side of Sardis. And it really was our foot in the door of being economically self-sufficient. It started, really without that cornerstone of our shopping center, I don't think we would have the success we have with the residential components, the light industrial, the future commercial expansions. So really, it was also a starting point of taxation. So it really got our membership comfortable with economic development and taxation. And without Vetter Crossing Plaza, I don't think you would see the success we have today in our community. It may be looking different, but it really was enabled us to provide for our membership through different programs, and enabled us to think differently and really begin that journey of zero dependency on the federal government. I like to tell the story. Before the shopping center, we were 90% dependent on federal transfers. And if you fast forward into today, now we have 90% own source revenue and 10% federal transfers, and those aren't any dependency. Those are transfers that any government that is implementing the jurisdictions we do are entitled to those flows of revenue streams from the federal government.
Do you take GST?
Right now, no, because that's a great question, actually. Right now, no, because of the federal policy on GST. Right now, the federal government has a policy that if First Nations are to enact a GST tax regime, they have a revenue sharing agreement with the federal government that, up to, I believe it's $500,000, the First Nation retains 95% of those revenues. Up to $1 million is split 50-50. After $1 million, the federal government, in fact, keeps 95% of those revenues. It makes zero sense to me. We are actively trying to push against that and working with the First Nations Tax Commission to create a new legislative relationship with the federal government to remove those caps on taxation so that we can truly begin to leverage those. And if you look across the country, First Nations, when they have those types of revenue streams, we're likely spending it quicker than any other government is because we have $350 billion in infrastructure gaps to close. We have to help support our members to build homes, whatever it may be, provide critical infrastructure. So, in my mind, opening up these taxation and these economic toolboxes will in fact really enhance our local, our provincial, and our Canadian economy.
So I guess that council's worry about no one would shop there didn't play out.
No, it didn't at all. No, not even close.
Can you put a number, approximate revenue it brings in?
Yeah, so we do I believe it's about $45 million a year in taxation revenue alone, or $50 million in taxation revenue. That's just, and then we have about another, in total, I believe it does about $70 or $80 million if you're talking about, rent rates, taxation, and the economic impact is greater than that. If you look at the shopping center coupled with our other developments, we're about $500 million a year in economic impact.
And so with that, of course, it enables you to concentrate on things like healthcare and mental health, addictions, issues.
Yeah, so one of the stats I'm most proud of is we have no kids in the care of the ministry. We have a heavy prevention lens on what we do, and that's really subsidized by us, not by the federal government. We know it's important to invest in mental health, in the well-being of our children and our families, and that's something we're able to do because of our economic self-sufficiency.
And that's such a big, important part of this discussion about First Nations economic development. The same thing with the Haisla and the money coming out of the LNG project, and they built a healthcare center and they built a community center.
Yes, and that's the exciting part for me. Is we've done about 37 units of affordable housing in the last 4 or 5 years. We are actively buying land to go and expand for future housing developments for our members. Our members are really, they have the education, the career, so they can build their own homes, or wanting to provide the opportunity for them to do so. We're providing roads that the city of Chilliwack needs, looking at doing public infrastructure in the form of public schools, recreation sites that are benefiting the community at large. But what that takes is the need to expand our land base, and we can move quicker than municipalities in these processes as well, which is, if you look at the rising cost of housing, to build anything in this province or country, a lot of it is delays in permitting and how long that takes, and we have an advantage in that where we can move a lot quicker.
So you've been having tremendous success. But we all know there are still reserves and First Nations that are under boil water advisories and in desperate shape.
Yes, and that's where I think a lot of the creative measures that we're taking at these institutions to try to open up different economic opportunities, whether that's through resource projects, through taxation on, there's a First Nations resource tax that's being proposed to the federal government, that the federal government would cede tax base to resource projects being done in our traditional territories. That would help those very rural and remote communities who are going without, who are on boil water advisories and unfortunately living in conditions that most Canadians can't even really imagine, right? And so it's important to think, a lot of the work that I enjoy doing now is thinking of how can we create these revenue streams that now communities can go and leverage and go and close their infrastructure gaps, provide clean water, get their communities off those boil water advisories so that their communities can begin to prosper. So it is important to think of, we don't like to use the term, but the have-nots, the ones who really unfortunately have been put in this situation through the colonial process, through the assimilation process, and through many of the legislative processes that have really tried to constrain First Nations into where we are today.
So do you look around at other examples of success and take some of their good ideas?
I absolutely do. Yeah, one of the guys I really enjoy picking his brain right now is Stephen Lee, the Musqueam Capital Corp CEO. I also like to look to the MST Musqueam Slabo2 Squamish partnership, what they've done. You look at Haisla. You look back east in what Wab Canoe's doing in Manitoba with Winnipeg, some urban reserves. You look to the Ontario provinces for Hydro One, and a lot of the projects that are being done across the country around equity ownership into resource projects and being very strategic with how we're participating in these projects. And that's where I really try to learn, to listen, to steal, to take advice from. But I'm also in the same breath where I share everything and anything that I can with any First Nations community that asks, because I really want to see them prosper as well.
Equity is the important
Yes.
word you mentioned there, because I think some people think, well, it's just assigning a deal and and therefore certain privileges result, but you are very active.
Yes, equity is so important. We want to be at the table making decisions. We don't want to be passive investors anymore. We have the capital to be participating in these projects. And we also have a lens on, especially when you're looking at resource projects, we have a lens that, ensures a bit more environmental oversight on some projects.
So you bring your cultural values into all of these developments.
Yeah.
Well, congratulations.
Yeah.
It's just such a wonderful story, and I know that it's going to be growing. And especially some of the federal initiatives will be interesting to see if anything happens.
It will.
Good luck.
Interesting. Thank you. Thanks for having me.
We'll be back in just a moment. The future economic growth and success of British Columbia is intertwined with the economic success of our First Nations. Chief Derek Epp is one example, but so is Chief Councillor Crystal Smith of the Haisla Nation. Her support and commitment to the LNG industry over many years has helped make it happen. Just two examples of many. Let me know your thoughts on YouTube. Till next time, I'm Carole Taylor.